Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we are looking at some absolutely colossal numbers. We're talking trillions of dollars here. I mean, the sheer staggering scale of global military spending is it's massive. It's a topic that literally affects national economies, global supply chains, and honestly, our everyday lives. But the numbers are just so huge they can be kind of hard to wrap our heads around. So our goal today is to objectively demystify these massive budgets. We're going to use the data to see exactly where the money actually goes, what it buys, and what kinds of trade-offs are made along the way. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to kick things off with the global military bill, then head inside America's defense budget. After that, we'll look at protecting commerce and sea lanes, weigh military versus health spending, and finally, wrap it all up with the opportunity costs. Right. Part 1, the global military bill, tracking trillions worldwide. So, before we get into analyzing all the percentages and economic impacts, we really need to just focus on the absolute numbers for a second. $954 billion. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI for short, that's the estimated military spending for the United States for the year 2025 alone. It's a number that immediately anchors the whole scale of our conversation. We are talking about nearly $1 trillion coming from just a single nation. Now, what's really fascinating is how that huge number actually stacks up internationally. You've got the US at the top with $954 billion, right? Then China follows at an estimated $336 billion, and Russia is third at $190 billion. To put that into perspective, the US accounts for nearly 40% of all global military spending. They are far, far outpacing the next largest spenders. But hold on, watch what happens when we shift our perspective a bit. If we look at military spending as a percentage of a country's gross domestic product, its GDP, well, that completely changes the list of top spenders. Suddenly, Ukraine tops the list, dedicating a massive 40% of its GDP to defense. Then they're followed by Algeria at 8.8%, Israel at 7.8%, Russia at 7.5%, and Saudi Arabia at 6.5%. This really highlights how regions that are deeply impacted by active conflict bear this incredibly heavy economic burden relative to the actual size of their economies. Moving on to part 2, inside America's defense budget, what does $850+ billion buy? Okay, so we've seen those massive top-line numbers, but what does that physically translate to on the ground? Zooming in on the United States, we first need a little historical context. Looking at the timeline of U.S. defense spending as a percentage of GDP, you actually might be surprised. Back during the Cold War, it was hovering between 8 and 10% of the economy. Post-Vietnam, it dropped down to around 4.5%, bumped back up during the Reagan era to about 6%, dropped to 3% in the Clinton era, and today it sits at about 3.1%. So the crucial takeaway here is that despite the absolutely massive dollar amount, the U.S. actually spends a historically low percentage of its national income on defense today compared to the Cold War. Basically, the U.S. economy has just grown significantly faster than its military spending over the decades. So where exactly is all that money going? Well, if you look at the breakdown, it's roughly a 50-50 split. About half the budget goes straight to personnel costs. That means paying the salaries and benefits of an all-volunteer force of 1.3 million active-duty troops, the reserves, and 750,000 civilian employees. You see, relying on conscription or a draft is cheaper, but maintaining a highly trained all-volunteer force, that is expensive. Now, the other half goes toward procurement, which is buying the actual physical equipment from private defense companies, as well as the research, development, and testing of brand new technologies. And what about America's global footprint? The U.S. currently operates roughly 750 overseas military facilities, and that costs about $55 billion. Now, you might be thinking, hey, wouldn't bringing them all home save a ton of money? But actually, the data shows that basing them domestically isn't inherently cheaper. Why is that? Because the main expenses, the salaries and the equipment, they cost the exact same regardless of where they're located. Plus, host countries like Japan and South Korea actually contribute billions of dollars themselves to offset the costs of having those U.S. troops stationed there. Let's jump to part 3, protecting commerce and sea lanes, the economic security of the seas. We're going to shift the narrative for a minute away from raw military hardware and toward how defense spending directly impacts our daily civilian lives and businesses. Take a look at this striking statistic from the Kansas City Chamber. Over 90% of global trade moves by sea.
This quote absolutely anchors the necessity of open sea lanes for global commerce. Seriously, whether it's electronics, cars, raw materials, or even the food on our tables, almost everything we buy every single day relies on a stable, secure maritime environment.
To really understand this economic role, we have to look at the sea services. See, the Navy doesn't just sail around looking intimidating, they actually secure the trade routes and the vital undersea cables that carry basically all of our global internet and banking traffic. Then you have the Marines helping to secure strategic global ports. The Coast Guard is out there maintaining 92,000 navigation aids and protecting domestic harbors, while the Merchant Marine provides specialized shipping that keeps shipping costs competitive. When you put it all together, these forces act as essential economic protectors. They prevent massive supply chain disruptions, keep inflation down, and ensure the everyday flow of goods that we all rely on.
All right, part 4. Military versus health spending, global budget priorities. Now, it's really important to ask how military budgets stack up against other critical sectors on a global scale. And here is a fascinating aha moment for you. If we look at historical global GDP averages tracked by SUPRI and the World Health Organization, governments worldwide spend an average of 5.9% of their GDP on public health. Compare that to just 2.3% on the military. That means, globally speaking, governments actually spend over 2.5 times as much on public health as they do on their armed forces. But of course, there are some pretty major regional variations there, which brings up a super engaging question. Are priorities shifting based on governance? Like, how do different types of governments actually choose to allocate the wealth of their nations?
Well, based on the SIPRI data, the answer is pretty striking. When you look at democracies, 93% of them spend more on health than they do on the military. However, when you look at autocracies, almost 50% prioritize military spending over their public health budgets. So the data neutrally points out a clear trend here. Governments that are directly accountable to their people overwhelmingly tend to prioritize public health budgets over defense.
Finally, part 5, the opportunity costs, the trade-offs of trillions.
Here, we're exploring the broader economic and philosophical question of what else these massive trillion-dollar resources could theoretically achieve. Let's make sure we clearly define our terms so we fully grasp the economic framework here. Opportunity cost is simply the potential civilian uses of resources that are lost when money is instead spent on the military. It's really the ultimate budget trade-off. Essentially, every dollar spent on a tank is a dollar not spent on a school, a hospital, or green energy infrastructure. Civil society campaigners frequently point to the SIPRI data to demonstrate exactly this trade-off. Because global military spending is so incredibly vast, we're talking nearing $2 trillion globally, even a tiny fraction of that represents massive wealth. Campaigns often show how a mere 10% global reduction in military spending, or even just a 1% donation from defense budgets, could fully fund major United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It just highlights exactly how far these funds could go if they were applied in a civilian context. Which leaves us with this final, truly provocative thought to ponder. Knowing the sheer scale of the costs, maintaining global supply chains, fielding all volunteer forces, projecting power, against the massive opportunity costs for public health and global development, how should the world allocate its resources? It is arguably the most complex budget trade-off of our time. I really hope this explainer gave you a clear, structured understanding of the actual data behind those trillions and leaves you eager to dig deeper into the true cost of global security. Thanks so much for learning with me today.